Welcome to part 3 in the Mongoose BOD integration tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a look at how Mongoose processes inbound BODs and sends outgoing BODs from other applications. Let's review what we've done up to this point. We created the replication document for purchase order and tied it to INNO_PO header. We then created an inbound cross-reference so that when we received a sync purchase order, we will receive the purchase order information. We also built an application on top of a table, which is on top of the purchase order header IDO, which has a sub-collection of PO lines. We now have all the pieces to receive a document and place the information into our table. Before we move on, let's test our replication document. To test it, we could receive a BOD from an application and hope that it works, but the easiest way is to re-receive an existing BOD. In our inbox, we know that we have our BOD 374, and it's been processed, meaning that Mongoose has consumed the BOD and processed the information. We can't uncheck that box and resend it, so we'll have to go into the SQL table and alter it manually. There are 4 SQL tables contained inside of the Mongoose application database that denote incoming and outgoing BOD interactions with ION. We have the inbox entry and inbox headers, and the outbox entry and outbox headers. We're going to look at the inbox entry for the entry where C_ID equals 471. This is the BOD that we received, and the XML info is encoded. Since we want to see the encoded XML info, we can execute a cast of C_XML as XML. Once we re-execute this, we'll get a column that's translated that blob into XML. Clicking on it shows the information in the tree form inside of SQL. The checkbox labeled processed was this one, was processed. Changing the value from a 1 to a 0 will allow us to reprocess the information and verify that we're able to receive a BOD correctly. Back in our app, we've created a button that clears all the PO information, so I'll press that. We need to create a statement that's going to update this info. Executing this affects one row, and if we refresh our data, we have our 374 back in here. But what if we didn't receive the information? We can see how it's actually executing that. Let's clear our PO information, and we're going to disable our inbound bus service. If we stop this service, we're still doing replication, but we're not using the inbound bus service any longer. Just a reminder that the inbound bus service monitors those sites for information coming in from our bus site, which was the ION bus. Now we're going to run an application called Bus Inbox Service. This runs the inbound bus service locally and gives us a visual display of what's happening. Under Program Files, Infor, Mongoose, we're looking for an app called businboxhost.exe. This app provides us with a nice way of debugging this information. Next, we're going to set our Bootstrap site, which is the default site we selected earlier, and we're going to tell it to process all inbox messages. It keeps track of which messages have been processed and skips those, so by processing all of them, we ensure that we process our message. Back at our document, set the process flag to 0, which indicates that it hasn't yet been processed. It will remain 0 until the bus inbox service picks it up. When we start the bus inbox service, we expect to see a lot of info related to all the different transactions that could be happening in the lower frame. And if it finds a transaction that needs to be processed, it'll move it up to the frame above. Click Start, and it found 471. We can take a detailed look at how it's translating the XPath in the frame below. We see that it's picking up the sync purchase order, then reads through the XML information and maps that XPath info to properties on our IDO and table. Double-click the sync purchase order, and we see that this was the BOD that was transmitted. We can then see what the IDO request was going to be. Notice that our purchase order number PO num, which is a property on our INNO_PO header IDO, has mapped that purchase order number to our PO number listed on PO header. Here we have our PO item property that's located on PO lines, and of course we have the information there. If we go back and refresh the data in purchase order headers, we see our translated data. Ultimately, if we were creating our Mongoose app, we wouldn't want our suppliers to log into this format of the form, and we'd rather they log into a web portal. This is the same Mongoose app rendered in the web. The dropdown contains our purchase order where we can select our promised delivery date and save the changes. Okay, now let's talk about sending a BOD back. We spoke earlier about incoming BODs coming in from an inbox. Similar to our inbox, we have a replication document outbox. When we save information from our app, we trigger an outgoing BOD. Clear the filter and look at our latest BOD that went out. We just executed a process purchase order, but this process purchase order has an action expression of change in it. This means we're going to change the master record information, which is on the LN system. Mongoose sends the updated information, which is our promised delivery date of October 31st to ION, which sends it to LN. LN then receives the BOD and does an update to its data. So how does this replication document get generated? To answer that, let's look at our replication document. Similar to what we had before, we have header data and line item data. This document has already been created based on the values from our inbound sync BOD we received earlier. On the replication document form, let's look at our purchase order. Notice that we have an outbound cross-reference button. The outbound cross-reference can be very complex, but essentially we need to reference the table that relates to the IDO, and we're going to put it in as table bang to interrupt any updates that are done to that table. Any actions of update are going to generate a BOD verb of process purchase order whenever the PO header information is updated. Next, open the replication categories form. Categories are placeholders for triggers. In order to trigger the replication outgoing cross-reference, we have to denote a function and table here. Having table bang in the replication role and replication category generates an IDO request to transport data for the table, which looks up the cross-reference to figure out how to do the XML mapping. As far as BOD metadata is concerned, there are two different types of category objects, a table and a stored procedure. If the object is a table, then replication trigger generation will create a new trigger on the base table to start the flow of data that leads to the new outbound BOD. If the object is a stored procedure, then a remote method call to that object will have to be made by some piece of application code to that stored procedure. The outbound cross-reference would be table bang or SP bang, depending on whether the source of the replication was a base table operation or a remote method call. In the case of a remote method call, the name stored procedure does not actually exist in the database. It's simply used as a reference into the replication document outbound cross-reference. When we use table bang PO header, it cross-references this value contained in the replication categories and then refers to the object name, which is our PO header IDO. Whenever an update is made to INNO_PO header, it finds the info inside of the replication category, table bang PO header, relates that back to the replication document outbound cross-reference, which is table bang INNO_PO header, and then executes the BOD, process purchase order, for the BOD noun, purchase order. Now let's look at the header elements we created earlier in a little more detail. You'll notice that there are a few elements in here that are literals. Literal elements are hard-coded information that can contain expressions that include keywords for functions that allow us to publish information into the BOD that's going to be transmitted. For example, BOD ID information is going to transmit the purchase order ID number, the BOD noun purchase order, and the verb process. If we look at BOD ID, we input the information we need to communicate with ION, the purchase order information for the document ID, and then the noun and verb information. There are also functions that allow us to publish hard-coded values. For example, an action expression where its attribute is a literal, called action code with a value of change. Outbound documents must add all of the literal components that the receiving application expects to receive. Similar to the elements that Mongoose received and translated into header info, our receiving application also needs that information to process. This can be done for things like currency ID. In the replication document element for unit price, look at its attribute. We have a currency ID attribute that's a literal value, and we hard-coded USD. It doesn't have to be done that way, and properly we would have supplied a property here, but we didn't want to maintain currency inside of our application, and we knew that we'd only be exchanging US dollars, so we translated that as a hard-coded value. That information is expected by the receiving application, we just have to make sure we send it. If we've received the information using an existing BOD, as long as we've laid out our BOD correctly on this side, we should be able to transmit the appropriate information in an outbound BOD. Our processed flag in the replication document outbox says that ION has received the information and translated it correctly, but you can't know for certain that the information was received correctly unless you see it in the receiving application. This is where we can have a bit of a disconnect between our application and the receiving application. Mongoose and the receiving application might have slightly different ways of referring to and handling the same information. The solution to this is to use the OAGIS standard, which ensures that the information is in a format that ION can process and the receiving application can receive. We're going to wrap up our series here. In this video, we explained how Mongoose processes an inbound BOD and how to test and verify that the data is being correctly received. We also took a look at how Mongoose constructs an outbound BOD, processes it, and sends it. There is much more information regarding BODs in Mongoose that we didn't have time to cover in these videos, but we hope that you now have a solid starting point when leveraging the Mongoose framework to transmit and receive BODs.